Mr. Peoples here, and we're going to be talking today about the War in the East, continue our talk about the War in the East. We're going to continue talking about some major battles and the winners of those battles, and we're going to continue to try and talk about some of the important people here during the Civil War. We last left off talking about the first Battle of Bull Run. Remember, that was a Confederate victory, a Union loss, very embarrassing. Both sides believed that the war would only last a short time. But because of the number of casualties and dead and the difficulty in the fighting, this particular battle made everybody believe that the war was going to continue for quite some time. And so we're going to continue talking about what happened after the first Battle of Bull Run, and we'll move on from there. Please remember that you're only writing down the stuff that is in blue, and you write those down in the appropriate box in your notes page. All right. After the first Battle of Bull Run, the Union Army retreating back to Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln was very unhappy with the leadership. One of the things that became very clear was that the soldiers were not trained very well. They were, at the first sign of difficulty, they turned and ran back to Washington. And to prevent that from happening again, President Lincoln puts a new general in charge of the Union Army, and his task is to train the Army and make it a military unit. The man that he put in charge was a man named George B. McClellan, a young man about 34, 35, graduated from West Point, and he was placed in charge of 100,000 soldiers. And what he did immediately was he started to train that army. And for the rest of the war, anything that the Union Army did in any of the battles, you can go back to McClellan's training as being an important piece of the Union Army developing into the strong army that it would later become. Here's a picture of George B. McClellan. We're going to be talking about him in a little bit. We'll go a little bit more in depth with him. George B. McClellan, you'll notice his hand is in his coat, and that was pretty common back during the Civil War times. All of these Civil War generals had studied a man named Napoleon, who was this great leader in Europe, and many of their military tactics were based off of Napoleon's tactics. And there's a famous painting of Napoleon standing there, and he's got his hand in his coat. So a lot of these generals, when they got their pictures taken, would imitate that famous painting of Napoleon by sticking their hands in their coat. Okay, well, after the Union Army is trained, and it takes a few months for the Union Army to be trained. The Battle of Bull Run takes place in July of 1861. The Union Army doesn't get moving again till the spring of the next year, till about March or April of 1862. It takes all that time to train the Union Army. And Abraham Lincoln was actually getting quite impatient with McClellan. The fact that he had had all this time to train the Army, but still the Confederates were still sitting not far away from Washington, D.C. in Manassas, where the Battle of First Bull Run was fought. And so Lincoln starts to push McClellan into fighting a battle. And McClellan kept saying, we're not ready yet, but I'm coming with a plan. Finally, McClellan unleashes his plan and shows his plan to President Lincoln. And McClellan's plan was quite difficult. McClellan's plan was to take 100,000 soldiers and all of the supplies that go with it, put them on ships, and sail them down to a place in Virginia called the York-James Peninsula. And this peninsula has a direct line right to the Confederate capital of Richmond. Now, this is a more dangerous type of plan than, say, going right to the Confederates and fighting them. But Lincoln was willing to see McClellan move and do something with the Army, so he approved this plan that later became known as the Peninsula Campaign. And I'm going to leave this PowerPoint here and show you the plan and talk about this campaign a little bit more in-depthly. So we're going to go to here, and just to kind of give you some idea on these things, we have these two blue dots represent the Union armies near Washington. One of them is McClellan's, and the other is going to stay near Washington to protect the capital. This red dot represents the Confederate Army, and they're located right here at this orange triangle. The triangle represents Manassas, Virginia, where the first Battle of Bull Run was fought. And then over here we have Stonewall Jackson's corps, and so another Confederate army and another Union army out here in the mountains of the Appalachians. Okay. Now, as I said, McClellan's plan was to take 100,000 soldiers, sail them down to the York-James Peninsula, located right here. The goal is to get to Richmond, the Confederate capital. When McClellan gets finally moving in the spring of 1862, the Confederates also start to return to Richmond to make sure that they defend their capital from the Union. And the Union Army then starts to move a little bit further south because the threat is not in Washington anymore. Now, McClellan gets to the peninsula. He gets all those soldiers, all those supplies on the peninsula, but the army encounters some pretty horrible weather. It rains for almost an entire month, making the roads all muddy, making it difficult to get supplies and things through the roads, not to mention the fact that the maps that the Union Army had were incorrect, and they had to actually purchase maps when they got to the south to figure out where they were going. When McClellan finally moves forward and meets the first example of any kind of Confederate army, and that you can see right here in the red line, when he first meets the Confederates, he believes that he is standing in front of a very large Confederate force, when in reality there was only about 1,000 men there in front of him. He has 100,000 men, and in front of him are only about 1,000 or so. And he believes that it's a lot bigger. And so he stops. And at that red line, which is near a town called Yorktown, he waits. And he actually writes President Lincoln for reinforcements. He says, I need more soldiers. I'm outnumbered here. Well, what the Confederate colonel located at this red dot had done is he had made his soldiers come out of the woods and shoot at the Union at different places along the line to make it seem like there were more soldiers there. And it did a very good job of fooling McClellan. This gave the rest of the Confederates time to get down to Richmond and prepare their defenses. Now, McClellan finally decides to attack this small force. And when he does so, the night before, those Confederates, they actually leave the night before the attack happens, and they head to Richmond to join the rest of the Confederate army. McClellan marches into Yorktown screaming, we've won a great victory, when in reality there was no fight because the Confederates had left. But he believes that this is a great victory, and so he writes Lincoln of that, and he very quickly this time starts rushing towards Richmond with his soldiers. But he stopped again outside Richmond, and he stopped close enough to where the Union soldiers could hear the bells of the towers in Richmond. And he stops again, and he stops because he hits the defenses of the Confederates. And McClellan pauses there, where if he were to attack, he possibly could have ended the war and won right there, being that he had 100,000 soldiers to about 25,000, 30,000 soldiers. But he believes he's outnumbered, so he stops and waits. While he waits, the Confederates actually attack his force, and in the midst of those attacks, the Union holds them off, but the Confederates need a new general. The general that they had in charge, Joseph Johnston, was wounded, and they place another man in charge, a man by the name of Robert E. Lee. And so I'm going to head back to the notes here because we're going to make sure we put that into our notes. Robert E. Lee is placed in command of the Confederate forces. And Robert E. Lee decides to do something that nobody would ever think of doing. He was outnumbered, and he decides to divide up his army so that he can attack McClellan. And he's hoping that McClellan doesn't attack him. And McClellan, being that he was so slow to come up the peninsula, Robert E. Lee was correct on this. So Robert E. Lee attacks the Union forces over the course of 7 days. That became known as the 7 Days Battle. And after each battle, the Union won each battle. But McClellan decided to retreat after each battle. So after every day, the Union would win a victory, and then McClellan would retreat back further. And then the next day would retreat again. And so what ends up happening is Robert E. Lee by attacking McClellan, is able to force McClellan off of the peninsula and causes the Peninsula Campaign to fail. And so we have a whole nother embarrassing loss for the Union, as the Union is forced off the peninsula and sent back to Washington, D.C. Okay? Now, Lincoln is very upset about this. Lincoln is mad that McClellan wouldn't attack. He's mad that the army is coming back to Washington. And he's so mad that he actually builds another army. And he builds this army near Washington, D.C., and he puts a man named John Pope in charge. And he orders John Pope to march to the Confederate capital of Richmond. But John Pope runs into the Confederates, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in the next section.